Hey guys, Ryan here. I'm back, welcoming us back from the break. Gonna do a sermon today, but first just want to say hey to all of you I haven't seen in a while, or some of you I probably haven't even met yet. I'm glad you're here. I'm glad you're in this core that you're in. I'm glad you're tuning in and listening together. We really do miss being all together in person, really hoping and praying that God will allow us to be reunited in that way soon. But until then, here we are again. We're going to be doing this as long as we need to. And I hope still you use this opportunity and don't miss out on the time you have with each other, even in this smaller group and over video, still learning and thinking through these things. If you don't know me, my name is Ryan, one of the campus pastors here. And today I'm introducing our spring sermon series, the first one for this spring. It's called Christian Ethics. We really felt like this would be helpful for all of us to think through just these ideas around how we act and think in the society that we live in as believers. So this first sermon's really just going to be pretty introductory, going over just kind of what we mean and framing some of this. And then we are going to dive into more specifics over the coming weeks. Garrett, next week, he will be talking to all of us about God's ethics specifically and our decision in that. And then Drew and Shayla, they'll be talking about the ethics of others, the ethics of self. And then the last 2 weeks, we'll be covering ethics of humanity in the future. So lots of exciting things coming your way and our way with this sermon series. And I really hope you just make it a priority to be here with us every week. Be here, be with your core folks, show up for them, and then really dive in and discuss and learn through these topics. I guess just an introductory point on this, and maybe why we think this would be valuable, or one of the reasons why, is that we live in a very pluralistic and postmodern society. I don't mean to throw those out there just as big words. You may or may not be familiar with that if you've taken classes or just learned about it. One of the things about living in this time period is that as Christians, especially, we live under a lot of tension because of these different varying viewpoints on truth. You have all these viewpoints out there that are vying for your loyalty and vying for your belief and action, and all of them claiming to be holding some sort of truth in there. On one hand, we're Christians, and it means we should follow God, and then, also we're Americans, so we should act like it. Or you're from a different country, and there's certain kind of ideas about loyalty and ways you should act based out of that, perhaps. Or maybe just more generally, we're modern people, and we should know better than to believe ancient thinking. Some of that stuff. I'm just kind of throwing out trying to ping some stuff that maybe has to do with this idea of different viewpoints that can compete for our attention. To just kind of raise in your mind that this idea of knowing what is true and knowing how to stand on that can be tricky. And so we really wanted to use this time talking about Christian ethics to try to grasp onto some of this stuff and hopefully give us all some things to think through in terms of moving forward. So first things first, as always, I want us to make sure we know what we're talking about. What do we mean by this word ethic? Essentially, ethics are just kind of consistent guidelines for a rule of thought. So ethics are consistent guidelines for a rule of thought. It's about thought. It's about thinking, which most of us are probably aware thoughts influence our behavior, right? So ethics essentially deals with the questions around morality, right thinking, right living, etc. Now, it is easy, I think, to assume from the get-go, everybody's got an ethic that they live by. But I would argue that we may be assuming a little bit too much there when we think that. I think that realistically a great number of us live kind of more by just a general doing whatever we see fit. And what we see as fit or right living, it just can and often does come from a very wide variety of sources. Influences we had growing up, media we ingest now, our education, our relationships with others, etc. And so what I think can happen for a lot of us, rather than having this kind of overall ethic, we become kind of reactionary. It's easy to embody just kind of the shades of the surrounding culture, the surrounding rhetoric. We just kind of pick it up, and the behavior we see, we just kind of pick it up. And we kind of just ride this culture train from stop to stop. And we live without any kind of foundation of absolute truth that grounds everything else in how we think and how we act. And you may be thinking, that's not me. I'm a Christian. Or you may think I'm different because of these factors, and I could list them. Or, you might be like, I read a lot of different viewpoints actually, so I know I'm informed and I've made these decisions consciously and whatnot. And all that stuff for sure has an effect on how you think, what you view as right or wrong. But it's kind of still a far cry from this idea of a grounded, fully embodied set of ethics. And it can be just detached from the truth of God. So, this brings me to my first point. Before we get into specific views on ethics today, again, just clearing some brushwork. First point is there is such a thing as absolute truth. There is such a thing as absolute truth. Okay, earlier at the beginning I mentioned how we live in this pluralistic and postmodern world. If you're not familiar with what I mean by that, essentially I'm saying there is currently an extremely powerful and pretty pervasive train of thought that asserts that truth is not something that is objective. It's not something guaranteed. This isn't always stated explicitly in things, often implicitly, sometimes explicitly. But in general, we are taught to think that there are many possibilities of truth to be had, that many good things can lead us to the truth, and that each person's perspective is their truth and that is good. And who are we to say that it's wrong? But friends, this is it's a new kind of thinking. There's a reason it's called postmodernity. It's past this modernity movement that was about kind of like finding scientifically right answers to things. And then postmodernity kind of swung the other direction and started rejecting a lot of that. That's very oversimplified, but just broad strokes. But not only is it new, but it's very detached from reality. Just a scriptural example that I think can help us think through this. 1 John 4:6 says, "We are from God. Whoever knows God listens to us. Whoever is not from God does not listen to us. By this we know the spirit of truth and the spirit of error." And in John 14:6, Jesus himself says, "I am the way and the truth and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me." And those are kind of hard to hear in the face of pluralism or of postmodernity. You see, Christianity and Christian thought, it flies in the face of all that. It asserts that truth is found in Jesus. And it's really honestly hard to overstate, I think, just how pervasive this type of thinking is, even sometimes in Christian circles. We are enveloped in a lot of these ideas of postmodernity, and we often just have no idea. It's even reflecting personally. It's been years for me now following Jesus, and honestly, years of thinking through this issue specifically. And yet still, I run into days where people in community or God reveal to me some assumptions or subjectivity I've held over and above the truth of God. And so I'm just here to tell you it takes time, right? It takes time to uncover and peel back the layers of our thought, to really dig in and figure out where these things came from. So let me just say, I encourage you to take this seriously. I encourage you not to throw up defensiveness here. and assume that you're already, I'm already past that, or I don't think that way, or I haven't been susceptible to all of that. Be in community, be with the people of God, and be in communication with God himself. The Spirit is given, it says, to teach us all things. And so we need to be serious about this. One of the best examples, honestly, I could think of was the movie Inception. You guys have had plenty of time to see it, okay? In that movie, the protagonist, he has this ability to plant ideas in people's mind so deep, through these layers of dream, so that when the person wakes up, they don't know the genesis or the origin of the idea. So therefore they don't suspect it, and friends, I want to argue this is what goes on with us, right? In this area of ethics, in this area of relativity and competing ideas, they're buried so deep that we often don't even know that they're there or where they came from or where they're off base from God. We assume we believe God's truth, but in reality, we are often far off. So, truth belongs to God. It's embodied in Jesus, like that John 14:6 passage says. And secularism considers the individual to be the holder and the determiner of truth. Christianity says that all truth belongs to God. We can't manufacture it or change it. We must simply believe it. So this leads me to my next point. Point number 2, the truth is not and never will be created or changed by humans. The truth is not and never will be created or changed by humans. Harry Blameyer's, he's a theologian who studied under C.S. Lewis for a while, and I think has a lot of helpful clarity on some of these issues in particular. So a lot of what I'm going to share in this point comes from his work on reflecting on this. And I'm just going to paraphrase a quote from one of his books called The Christian Mind. And he says, essentially, there is no rational basis for the notion that mixing together a number of conflicting views will produce your arrival at truth. You cannot construct truth from a mass of different material. You cannot construct truth at all. You can only discover it. In our society, truth is assumed that a great number of educated opinions will create a sort of truth pudding. It's concocted and rendered true by all the sources. In reality, truth is much more like a rock than a pudding. A rock which you lay bare by scraping away the soil. And that soil is largely made up of various human prejudgments and opinions. So a lot in that. But we see this, right? There's these ideas we have in our society that we hold dear. We have peer-reviewed articles, polling, debates, public forum style, figuring out the best way to move forward. So listen closely. I'm not saying all of that is bad. That's not what I'm getting at here. That style of working through different issues can be helpful in certain circumstances. What I am trying to say, though, and bring to light, is that when it comes to truth, absolute truth about the nature of the cosmos, the nature of being human, what the meaning of life is, what we're here for, all of that, all of these things that eventually play into our ethics, the truth there is only made and only found in God. So we can no more create a new version of it than we can take credit for the original version. It's God's truth. And we discover it like that rock underneath all the soil. And friends, this is what is so offensive to our modern sensibilities and to secularism. It offends people to think that we are claiming truth over their versions of it. But it's important to realize the distinction here. Once again, it's not our truth. It's God's. We simply believe it. if it's offensive, I would argue they need to take that up with God. It's not our truth they're butting heads against, it's His. So that frees us to love them, to pray for them, to live life with them, certainly not to condescend them as we talk about these things. But again, above all, we are responsible just to point them to God, not to ourselves, not to our own ideas, but to point them towards God, where they will ultimately find truth. We don't hold some, special secret knowledge that only certain ones out there can have access to. That's Gnosticism. That came about a long time ago and has been put to bed as heresy. It's not true. It's not some secret special truth we possess. We simply just hold the truth of God as absolute, and we invite everyone, all, to come and experience living in that truth. So that was point number 2. The truth is not and never will be created or changed by humans. And this last thing I want to say, point number 3, if we accept God's truth, we must strive to live by it. If we accept God's truth, we must strive to live by it. I won't go too much into this one because this is really a setup for what Garrett is going to dive into next week, talking about God's truth and our response to it. But as we wrap up just this introduction to this idea of ethics, the whole reason I wanted to start with this idea of objective and subjective and this idea of absolute truth and how that butts up against our current culture, I wanted to do that so we can do a heart check right out of the gate on this one. On this sermon series, I wanted us to start with this here. So I want us to see what is being pinged kind of internally for us. And I wanted each one of us to ask ourselves some questions here. And in a minute, I want you to discuss those things with each other in the core. So first, let me just ask some of these questions, and I'll read them a couple times and go slow so that you can write them down in your phone or in a journal, and because I'm going to have you spend some time reflecting on them individually before you discuss them as a core. So remember, we're doing the heart check, just kind of seeing what is being pinged here for us internally. But first question, where do you go first to get your idea of what is true? Where do you go first to get your ideas of what is true? Is it in prayer? In Christian community? In seeking the Holy Spirit? If none of those, where? Where do you go to get your idea of what is true? Where do you go first? Second one, does it offend you to think that God holds the only truth? Does that strike you as wrong? Does something sit wrong there with you? Does it offend you to think that God holds the only truth? Or does it comfort you? Why? Does it offend you to think that God holds the only truth? Or does it comfort you? And why? And then lastly, what role has this idea around ethics played in your life up until now? So remember, ethics being a set of guidelines for a rule of thought. So what role has this idea of ethics played in your life up until now? And how have you decided to think and act? How have you decided to think and act? I think I said last one already, but I lied. There's one more. Is there anywhere you resist God in this area of Him holding truth, or in this area of ethics? Is there anywhere you resist God in this area? Okay, so I'm going to give you guys a few minutes here, like I said, just to journal and reflect. You can do that on your phone or in a journal. And I encourage you to be in conversation with God as you do this. So yeah, I want you to just take about 5 minutes in your cores and do this individually. And then I want you to go ahead and talk to each other about what you've reflected on. And this is your discussion for core for today. I really want you to dive into this with each other. And I don't want this to go quickly. I don't want this to be something you breeze through. Be like, yeah, I thought about this. And then someone's like, yeah, I also thought about this. And then you just kind of move on quick. I want you guys to dive into this. Talk to each other. Ask good follow-up questions when someone shares something. You know, if they only answer one question, encourage them to answer one of the other ones too. And just spend some time with it. Okay? Well, thanks, guys. That's our intro for this sermon series. I look forward to hearing some of your feedback and what you're learning and thinking through, and also to seeing you guys next time. All right, bye.